What if I told you that 10,000 years ago, you could walk from London to Paris without ever getting your feet wet? That beneath the cold, gray waters of the North Sea, there's an entire lost world where people once lived, hunted, and raised families? A place that simply vanished from existence, taking its secrets with it into the deep. Close your eyes and imagine Europe 10,000 years ago. Britain isn't an island. Instead, a massive stretch of land connects it directly to mainland Europe. This isn't some barren wasteland frozen in ice. It's paradise. Rolling grasslands stretch toward the horizon. Rivers carve through valleys filled with oak and hazel forests. Herds of deer and wild horses thunder across the plains while birds fill the sky above pristine lakes. And there are people. Families gathering around fires. Children laughing along riverbanks. Hunters tracking game through morning mist. This land was home to thousands, maybe tens of thousands of humans who had no idea their entire world was living on borrowed time. They called this place home, never knowing that one day every trace of it would disappear beneath the waves. This was Doggerland, and until recently we had no idea it even existed. The year was 1931. A fishing trawler dragged its net across the bottom of the North Sea, somewhere between England and the Netherlands. The crew hauled up their catch expecting fish. Instead, something impossible tumbled onto the deck. Tangled in the net was a chunk of ancient peat, and sticking out of it was a weapon, a barbed point carved from deer antler, crafted by human hands thousands of years ago. The fishermen stared in disbelief. They were 40 meters below sea level. How could a Stone Age tool be sitting on the ocean floor? This wasn't from a shipwreck. This came from the ground itself. The artifact made its way to a museum where experts confirmed what seemed impossible. This tool was over 9,000 years old, created when this patch of ocean was dry land. But one strange object proves nothing. It was easy to dismiss as a fluke, a mystery with no answer. Until the sea started giving up more secrets. More fishing boats began pulling up bones. Ancient tools, fragments of worked wood, mammoth tusks. Each new discovery whispered the same impossible truth. An entire landscape was hidden beneath the North Sea. Scientists gave it a name, Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, a shallow area where many artifacts surfaced. Using sonar mapping and seafloor surveys, researchers began reconstructing this drowned kingdom. What they found took their breath away. Doggerland wasn't some small strip of land. At its peak, it covered nearly 100,000 square miles, an area roughly the size of Great Britain itself. Advanced mapping revealed ancient river systems snaking across the seabed. Scientists found evidence of hills, coastlines, and vast wetlands that once teemed with life. The people who lived here weren't simple wanderers. They built seasonal camps, returned to favorite hunting grounds year after year, and developed rich cultures we're only beginning to understand. Some archaeologists believe Doggerland was the heartland of prehistoric Europe, a cultural crossroads where people, ideas, and traditions flowed freely. This wasn't the edge of civilization. This might have been its center, and then, slowly, inevitably, the sea began to take it all back. As the Ice Age ended, massive glaciers covering Europe started melting. Sea levels began to rise, not all at once, but inch by inch, generation by generation. The people of Doggerland probably noticed wetlands where there used to be forests, islands where there used to be hills, but the change was slow enough that they adapted, moved, rebuilt, until the day everything changed forever. Around 6200 BC, a massive underwater landslide occurred off the coast of Norway. The Storegga slide, as scientists call it, sent 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment crashing into the ocean depths. The result was catastrophic, a mega tsunami. Waves possibly 70 feet high roared across the North Sea at terrifying speed. Doggerland, already reduced to low-lying islands and marshes, was directly in the path. In hours, maybe minutes, generations of human history were erased. Did anyone survive? Did they tell stories of the Great Wave? We may never know. There's something that haunts me about Doggerland. These people didn't do anything wrong. They didn't ignore warnings or make fatal mistakes. They simply existed at a moment when the Earth was changing, and they were caught in forces beyond their control. Their entire world vanished, and for thousands of years, no one even knew they'd been there. But every artifact pulled from the sea is a voice crying out across time. Every bone, every tool says, "We were here. We mattered. We lived and loved and struggled just like you." And in a way, they're still with us. Their DNA flows in the veins of modern Europeans. We are their descendants, carrying forward a story that almost drowned forever. As our own sea levels rise, as our own coastlines shift and change, Doggerland asks us a troubling question. How permanent is the ground beneath our feet? What will be left of our world 10,000 years from now? Somewhere in the cold darkness of the North Sea, the answers are waiting, and the ocean isn't done giving up its secrets yet. Imagine standing on the white cliffs of Dover, looking across the English Channel toward France. Now imagine walking that distance. No boat, no tunnel, just solid ground beneath your feet, stretching all the way from London to Amsterdam. Sounds impossible, right? But 10,000 years ago, that's exactly what you could have done. Because between Britain and Europe, there was an entire country. A land larger than the United Kingdom itself, teeming with life, rich with resources, home to thousands of people. And then it vanished. Completely. Swallowed by the sea without a trace, erased from human memory so thoroughly that we didn't even know it existed until a fisherman's net dragged up the impossible. To understand what we lost, you have to go back, way back, to a time when the world was a very different place. The year is approximately 10,000 BC. The last ice age is finally loosening its grip on the planet. Massive glaciers that once covered half of Europe are retreating north, revealing land that hasn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. The climate is warming, becoming milder, more welcoming to life. But here's what most people don't realize. When you lock up that much water in ice, sea levels drop dramatically. We're talking about 300 feet lower than they are today, and when the seas drop that far, land appears. Lots of land, including a vast territory that stretched between what we now call England and continental Europe. This wasn't some narrow strip you could cross in an afternoon. This was a country, a real functioning landscape that would dwarf modern nations. Picture rolling hills covered in dense forests of oak, elm, and hazel. Imagine river systems so extensive they'd rival the Thames or the Rhine, carving valleys through rich, dark soil. Envision wetlands alive with waterfowl, marshes thick with reeds, and grasslands where herds of aurochs and wild horses grazed under endless skies. The air would have been filled with sounds we rarely hear anymore. The bugling of elk, the distant roar of brown bears, wolves howling at dusk, and woven through it all, the voices of humans. People who hunted, fished, built shelters, made tools, told stories, and raised children in a land so abundant it must have seemed like it would last forever. They had no name for their world. They didn't need one. It was simply home. But we've given it a name now, pulled from the depths of the sea that claimed it. Doggerland. For thousands of years, Doggerland kept its secrets. The sea covered it so completely, so thoroughly, that every trace disappeared. No ruins poked above the waves. No ancient texts mentioned a lost land in the North Sea. It was as if it had never existed at all, and humanity went about its business, drawing maps, building ships, sailing right over the top of a drowned world, completely unaware. Then, in 1931, something extraordinary happened. The captain of a fishing trawler named the Kalinda was working the waters off the coast of Norfolk, dragging his nets along the bottom of the North Sea. This was routine work, the kind of thing these crews did every day. Haul up the net, sort the catch, toss it back down, repeat. But on this particular day, when the net came up, tangled in the mass of fish and seaweed, was something that shouldn't exist, a lump of peat. Ancient, compressed, dark as coal. And jutting out from it, unmistakable in its craftsmanship, was a barbed point carved from deer antler. Someone had made this, shaped it, used it, but that someone had done so more than 9,000 years ago. And they'd done it on dry land that was now 40 meters underwater. The crew didn't know what to make of it. The object ended up at the Norwich Castle Museum, where archaeologists examined it with growing fascination. The preservation was remarkable. The craftsmanship was clear. This was a sophisticated hunting weapon from the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, but the location made no sense. Unless the seafloor hadn't always been seafloor. That single artifact sat quietly in museum storage for years, a puzzle piece without a puzzle. But fishermen kept finding things. Bones from extinct animals, fragments of worked wood, stone tools. Each discovery added weight to an impossible idea. What if there had been land there? What if people had lived there? And if so, where did it go? The real breakthrough came decades later when technology finally caught up with the mystery. In the 1990s and early 2000s, oil companies began surveying the North Sea floor using advanced sonar and seismic imaging. They were looking for oil and gas deposits, mapping the layers of rock and sediment beneath the waves. But what they found was far more valuable than fossil fuels. They found landscapes, ancient coastlines, river valleys, the unmistakable signatures of a land that once lived and breathed above the water. Scientists jumped on this data like detectives solving a cold case. Using three-dimensional seismic scans, they began reconstructing Doggerland piece by piece, pixel by pixel. And the picture that emerged was staggering. This wasn't just a land bridge, this was a country. At its maximum extent, around 15,000 years ago, Doggerland covered approximately 170,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's larger than modern-day Germany, bigger than California. It dwarfed the United Kingdom, which sits at around 93,000 square miles. This was a major geographic feature of prehistoric Europe, and we never knew it existed. The mapping revealed intricate details that brought the lost world into focus. Scientists identified a massive river system they called the Schotten River, which collected meltwater from glaciers and channeled it through Doggerland into the Atlantic. This river would have been enormous, possibly bigger than any river in modern Europe. Along its banks, the soil would have been incredibly fertile, enriched by floods that deposited nutrients season after season. The coastlines of Doggerland were complex and varied. There were sheltered bays perfect for fishing, rocky shores where seals basked, estuaries where fresh and salt water mixed, creating some of the richest ecosystems on Earth. Inland, the terrain shifted from dense forests in the southern regions to more open tundra in the north, offering diverse habitats for an astonishing variety of wildlife. And the wildlife was like something out of a dream. Mammoths still roamed the northern reaches, though they were declining. Red deer, roe deer, and massive elk populated the forests. Wild boar crashed through underbrush. Beavers built dams that created ponds and wetlands. The skies were filled with migrating birds, and the rivers teemed with salmon, pike, and eels. For a hunter-gatherer, this was paradise. Food was everywhere, abundant and varied. The people who lived here weren't primitive cave dwellers struggling to survive. Recent archaeological evidence suggests they were sophisticated, adaptable, and deeply knowledgeable about their environment. They built seasonal camps at strategic locations, returning year after year to places they knew would be productive. They crafted complex tools, not just for hunting, but for woodworking, hide processing, and fishing. Some sites show evidence of semi-permanent structures, suggesting communities that stayed in place for months at a time. What's particularly fascinating is Doggerland's role as a bridge. This wasn't just a place where people lived, it was a highway, a cultural corridor where ideas, technologies, and genes flowed freely between the British Isles and continental Europe. There were no borders, no passport controls, no sense of British versus European. It was all one connected world. People, animals, and plants moved back and forth naturally, creating a shared culture that spanned from what's now Spain to Scandinavia. Some researchers believe Doggerland wasn't just a bridge but the actual heartland of Mesolithic Europe. Think about it. The most fertile land, the richest hunting grounds, the safest harbors, all concentrated in one place. The populations living in what we now think of as Britain or the Netherlands might have been peripheral communities compared to the thriving centers in Doggerland itself. We've had the map backwards all along, but here's where the story takes a darker turn, because Doggerland's paradise was built on a foundation that was literally melting away. As the Ice Age ended and temperatures rose, those massive glaciers covering Scandinavia and northern Europe began to collapse. Trillions of gallons of water, locked up as ice for tens of thousands of years, started flowing back into the oceans, and sea levels began to rise. The process was slow at first, maybe an inch a year, maybe less in some decades, more in others. The people living in Doggerland wouldn't have noticed dramatic changes in their lifetimes, but over generations, over centuries, the signs would have been impossible to ignore. Favorite camping spots near the coast became tidal zones, then permanent shallows, then open sea. Hunting trails disappeared under marshes. Islands appeared where there used to be hills. Scientists estimate that between 18,000 BC and 6,000 BC, Doggerland underwent a slow-motion apocalypse. The landscape was constantly shifting, constantly shrinking. Communities would have been forced to adapt, to move, to abandon ancestral territories. The psychological impact must have been profound. Imagine your grandparents telling stories about places that no longer exist. Imagine watching the world literally get smaller with each passing year. By around 7000 BC, Doggerland had been reduced to an archipelago, a scattering of low-lying islands in the southern North Sea like a prehistoric Indonesia. People still lived there, still fished and hunted, but the glory days were over. The land was dying, and everyone knew it, but they couldn't leave. This was home. This was where their ancestors were buried, where their stories were rooted. And then came the final catastrophe. Around 6200 BC, off the coast of Norway, one of the largest landslides in history occurred. The Storegga slide, as geologists call it, sent 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment crashing down the continental slope into the deep Atlantic. To give you a sense of scale, that's roughly the volume of Iceland sliding into the ocean all at once. The displacement created a mega tsunami. Computer models suggest waves up to 80 feet high roared across the North Sea, traveling at speeds of over 400 miles per hour. Doggerland, already reduced to low-lying islands barely above sea level, was directly in the path. There would have been no warning, no time to gather belongings or seek high ground, just a wall of water appearing on the horizon, and then oblivion. How many people died that day? Hundreds. Thousands. We'll never know. What we do know is that archaeological evidence shows a sudden abandonment of Doggerland sites right around this time. The few islands that remained above water after the tsunami were eventually claimed by the rising seas over the next few centuries. By 6000 BC, it was over. Doggerland was gone. Britain was an island, and an entire world had vanished beneath the waves. But here's what haunts researchers. What else is down there? Every artifact recovered so far has come from fishing nets or shallow surveys. The deep sites, the main settlements, the places where people actually live their daily lives, remain untouched. The North Sea is not gentle with archaeology. Currents scour the seabed. Storms churn up sediment. With each passing year, more evidence is lost forever. We're in a race against time to recover what we can before the ocean erases it all. Some scientists have proposed underwater excavations using submarines and remote-operated vehicles to explore the ancient river valleys and coastlines. Others want to bring up sediment cores and analyze them for pollen, seeds, and microscopic traces of human activity. There's even talk of using environmental DNA to identify what species lived where. But it's expensive, technically challenging, and the North Sea is a dangerous, unforgiving work environment. So the Lost World keeps most of its secrets for now. There's something about Doggerland that gets under your skin, Maybe it's the scale of the loss, an entire country gone. Or maybe it's the unfairness of it. These people didn't do anything wrong. They didn't overfish or destroy their environment or wage wars that brought about their end. They simply had the misfortune of living in a place the Earth decided to reclaim. Their whole civilization was wiped out by forces they couldn't fight, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't even fully understand. But I think what really moves us is the erasure. For 8,000 years, nobody knew Doggerland existed. Think about that. A land that supported human life for thousands of years, that was home to countless generations. That was someone's entire world, simply vanished from human memory. No myths about it survived. No legends of a drowned kingdom. Nothing. It was as if it had never been. And yet, they're still here. The people of Doggerland didn't disappear completely. They fled to higher ground as the waters rose. They became the ancestors of the people who built Stonehenge, who settled the British Isles, who spread across Europe. Genetic studies show that modern Europeans, especially those in Britain and the Netherlands, carry DNA from Mesolithic populations that almost certainly included Doggerland's refugees. That fisherman who pulled up the Antler Point in 1931 might have been hauling up his own ancestors' tool. Separated by 300 generations, but connected by an unbroken thread of blood. Every one of us is surrounded by a world we take for granted. We assume the geography we see on maps is permanent, eternal, unchanging. Doggerland teaches us otherwise. Coastlines shift, climates change. What seems solid and eternal can vanish in geological instants. The ground beneath our feet is a temporary gift, not a permanent possession. And in our own time, as sea levels rise again, as coastal cities face the reality of abandonment, as climate refugees begin their own long migrations to higher ground, Doggerland whispers a warning from the depths. This has happened before. This will happen again. The question isn't whether the seas will rise. The question is whether we'll listen to the lessons of the past, or whether we'll join Doggerland in the realm of lost worlds. Somewhere beneath the cold, churning waters of the North Sea, there are campsites where children played, riverbanks where lovers met, graves where grandparents were laid to rest with ceremony and grief. There are places that matter deeply to people whose names we'll never know, whose languages we'll never hear, whose stories died with them in the waves. But every year, the sea gives a little back. A bone here, a tool there. Fragments of a world that refuses to be completely forgotten. And as technology advances, as our ability to explore and understand the ocean floor improves, we'll learn more. We'll piece together more of the story. We'll rescue more of Doggerland from oblivion. The question is, what else is waiting down there? What secrets still lie buried in the silt? What discoveries might rewrite everything we think we know about ancient Europe? The ocean knows. And one day, if we're patient, if we're careful, if we're respectful, it might just tell us. Until then, Doggerland waits in the darkness, a drowned kingdom beneath our feet, a reminder that even entire countries can vanish, and that forgetting is sometimes just a matter of time and tide. What if I told you that one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in European history was made by accident? That fisherman, just trying to catch dinner, kept pulling up the impossible from the bottom of the sea? Ancient weapons, extinct animal bones, tools crafted by human hands thousands of years before Egypt built its pyramids, and nobody believed them. For decades, these mysterious artifacts piled up in museums, labeled as curiosities, anomalies, mistakes, until one scientist looked at all these impossible pieces and realized they were telling the same story. There's an entire lost civilization down there, and we never knew it existed. The North Sea doesn't give up its secrets easily. It's one of the harshest marine environments in northern Europe. Cold, murky waters churn constantly under gray skies. Storms roll in without warning, turning calm waters into killing fields of 20-foot waves. The currents are relentless, scouring the seabed, moving sediment, burying and uncovering the ocean floor in an endless cycle. Visibility underwater is terrible, sometimes just a few feet, It's dark down there, silent except for the groan of water and the scrape of sand. For centuries, this sea was just an obstacle, a dangerous stretch of water between Britain and Europe that sailors had to cross, that merchants had to navigate, that fishermen had to brave for their livelihoods. Nobody thought about what was beneath the surface. Why would they? Seas are just seas, right? They've always been there, always will be. The idea that this particular body of water was hiding something, that it was keeping a secret that would rewrite human history, never crossed anyone's mind. But the North Sea floor is not what it seems. Beneath the sand and silt, beneath the rocks and the wrecks of ships lost to storms, there's something else, something that doesn't belong underwater. And in the early 20th century, fishermen started to notice. Picture a cold morning in 1931. A fishing trawler called the Kalinda is working the waters about 25 miles off the Norfolk coast. The crew is doing what they've done 1,000 times before, dragging a weighted net across the seabed, scooping up whatever's down there, hauling it back to sort. It's hard, dangerous work. Your hands freeze, your back aches, but it's a living. The winch groans as the net breaks the surface, heavy with the day's catch. Cod, haddock, the usual suspects. The crew starts sorting through the haul, tossing fish into baskets, and then someone stops, reaches down, pulls out something that makes no sense whatsoever. It's a chunk of peat, dense, dark, ancient compressed plant material. Stuck in the peat, like some kind of strange fossil, is a pointed object, about 9 inches long, barbed on one side, smooth and deliberately shaped. One of the fishermen turns it over in his weathered hands, and recognition dawns. This is a harpoon point, carved from deer antler. But that's impossible. They're 40 meters below sea level. This thing came from the ocean floor. The captain made a decision that changed history. Instead of tossing it back into the sea, he kept it. And when the Kalinda returned to port, he took it to someone who might know what it was. The artifact ended up at the Norwich Castle Museum, where a curator named Muir Evans examined it with growing astonishment. Evans was an expert in prehistoric tools. He'd seen thousands of Stone Age artifacts, but never one that came from the bottom of the North Sea. He analyzed it carefully. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. This was a Mesolithic hunting weapon, the kind used by hunter-gatherers in northern Europe between 10 and 5,000 years ago. The preservation was remarkable, thanks to the peat that had protected it from decay. But the location was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Unless the location was actually right, and everything else they thought they knew about the North Sea was wrong. Evans published his findings. The archaeological community reacted with polite skepticism. One artifact, found by fishermen who couldn't pinpoint exactly where it came from? Interesting, sure, but hardly proof of anything. It was probably an isolated incident, a fluke. Maybe it fell off a boat somehow. Maybe it was misidentified. The scientific establishment essentially patted Evans on the head and moved on. But Evans couldn't shake the feeling that this harpoon point was trying to tell him something important. And then the fishermen kept finding things. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, fishing crews working a particular area of the North Sea called Dogger Bank kept dredging up oddities. Bones, mostly. Massive bones from animals that had been extinct for thousands of years. Mammoth teeth the size of footballs, the jawbone of a woolly rhinoceros, antlers from giant elk that stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, fossilized wood from trees that should never have been on the ocean floor, and more human artifacts, stone tools, fragments of worked bone, pieces of what appeared to be ancient harpoons and spear points, each one carefully shaped by human hands, then lost for millennia, now tumbling out of fishing nets like messages from the past. These objects started accumulating in museums and private collections across Britain and the Netherlands, but they were treated as curiosities, odd footnotes. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody asked the bigger question, what if all these finds are related? What if they're all coming from the same place? The breakthrough began in the 1990s, but it came from an unexpected source: oil companies. North Sea oil exploration was booming, and energy corporations needed detailed maps of the seabed to find drilling sites. They deployed advanced sonar systems and seismic reflection technology, sending sound waves down through the water to map the layers of sediment and rock below. They were looking for oil. What they found was land. The seismic data showed something extraordinary. Beneath the sand and mud covering the North Sea floor, there were geological features that looked nothing like what you'd expect from an ocean bed. There were river valleys, distinct channels carved by flowing water, meandering across the seabed like the Thames or the Rhine. There were what appeared to be ancient coastlines, marking where land had once met sea. There were even features that looked like hills, now buried under marine sediment. A researcher named Bryony Coles was one of the first to recognize what this meant. In 1998, she published a paper that laid out a radical theory. All those random artifacts fishermen had been finding weren't random at all. They came from a massive prehistoric landscape that had once connected Britain to continental Europe. She called it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank where so many artifacts had surfaced. Coles's paper was a lightning bolt. Suddenly, all those mysterious finds made sense. They weren't anomalies, they were evidence of a drowned world. The scientific community, which had dismissed the fishermen's finds for decades, suddenly couldn't get enough of them. Every museum storage room was searched. Every collection was re-examined. Objects that had been sitting in drawers for 50 years, labeled as unknown origin or possible contamination, were pulled out and analyzed with fresh eyes. A team of researchers at the University of Birmingham took the lead in mapping Doggerland. They partnered with oil companies to access their seismic data, which covered thousands of square miles of the North Sea floor. Using sophisticated computer modeling, they began reconstructing the ancient landscape layer by layer, time period by time period. The maps they created were stunning. They showed Doggerland at different stages of its existence, from its maximum extent during the last glacial period to its final fragmentary islands before it vanished completely. The level of detail was extraordinary. Scientists could identify individual river systems. They could see where coastlines had been. They could pinpoint marshlands, lakes, and what appeared to be ancient lagoons. One of the most remarkable discoveries came from analyzing the sediment cores drilled from the seabed. These cores are like time capsules, preserving layers of history stacked on top of each other. By examining the pollen, seeds, and microscopic organisms in each layer, scientists could reconstruct what the environment was like at different periods. The cores revealed that Doggerland had been incredibly diverse. There were layers rich in oak and hazel pollen, indicating dense forests. Other layers showed grasses and herbs typical of open plains. Some cores contained pollen from wetland plants, marking ancient marshes and river deltas. And crucially, some cores contained charcoal that could only have come from fires, human fires. In 2012, a team of scientists working with the energy company Wessex Archaeology made a discovery that brought Doggerland into sharp focus. They were analyzing high-resolution seismic data from an area about 40 miles off the coast of Yorkshire when they found something that made them freeze. It was a three-dimensional image of the seabed showing what appeared to be a river delta with multiple channels spreading out like fingers, and along one of those channels there were distinct mounds, raised areas that looked artificial, possibly ancient settlements. The imagery was so detailed that researchers could estimate the size of the river that had created the delta. They called it the Schotten River, and it would have been massive, comparable to the modern Rhine. They could trace its course for miles across the seabed. They could see where tributaries joined it. And most exciting, they could identify locations where sediment had piled up in ways that suggested human activity, places where people might have built camps, fish traps, or even semi-permanent structures. But here's the frustrating part. They can't excavate. The North Sea is a brutal environment for underwater archaeology. The currents are too strong. The visibility is too poor. The water is too cold and deep for divers to work safely for extended periods, and the seabed is constantly shifting. A feature that's exposed one year might be buried under 3 feet of sand the next. So scientists have had to get creative. They use something called grab sampling, where a mechanical claw is lowered to the seabed and brings up buckets of sediment that can be sifted for artifacts. They deploy underwater cameras and sonar to map features without disturbing them. And they rely heavily on the continued cooperation of fishermen who, to this day, still occasionally pull up pieces of Doggerland in their nets. In 2019, a recreational diver off the coast of the Netherlands found something that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. At a depth of about 30 meters, partially exposed by recent storms, was a fragment of a human skull. Clearly ancient, embedded in peat, unmistakable. It was sent for analysis, and the results were staggering. The bone was over 9,000 years old. It belonged to a middle-aged man who had lived and died in Doggerland. This was the first actual human remain ever recovered from the lost world. The skull fragment raised as many questions as it answered. How did this man die? Was he buried or did he drown? Are there more human remains down there, just waiting to be uncovered by the right storm or the right current? And most tantalizingly, what might be preserved in the deeper, undisturbed parts of Doggerland? Here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. Everything they've found so far has been by accident or through remote sensing. Nobody has conducted a systematic, large-scale excavation of a Doggerland site. The artifacts that fishermen pull up are random, scattered by currents, torn from their original contexts. The sonar maps are extraordinary, but they can't tell you the details. They can't show you what people ate for dinner, what stories they told, what gods they worshipped. There's a massive debate in the scientific community right now about how to approach Doggerland going forward. Some researchers are pushing for ambitious underwater excavations using submarines, robotic arms, and advanced preservation techniques. They argue that the technology exists to do careful scientific archaeology even in the harsh conditions of the North Sea. They point to other underwater sites that have been successfully excavated, like the Bronze Age settlements in the Swiss lakes or the ancient city of Pavlopetri off the coast of Greece. But others urge caution. They point out that excavating underwater is incredibly expensive. A single season of work can cost millions. The artifacts that are recovered need special treatment, or they'll disintegrate when exposed to air. And there's the ethical question. If we can't properly preserve what we find, should we be disturbing it in the first place? Maybe it's better to leave Doggerland where it is, documented but untouched, rather than risk destroying irreplaceable evidence through clumsy intervention. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking. Every year, currents erode more of the seabed. Every storm churns up sediment and scatters artifacts. Fishing nets continue to drag across the bottom, inadvertently destroying what might be invaluable archaeological contexts. And there's a new threat: offshore wind farms. As Europe invests heavily in renewable energy, the North Sea floor is being transformed with massive turbines anchored in the seabed. Each installation has the potential to disturb or destroy Doggerland sites. Some archaeologists have managed to partner with wind farm developers, conducting surveys before construction begins. These partnerships have led to some remarkable finds. In 2017, a pre-construction survey for a Dutch wind farm uncovered a dense scatter of stone tools in an area that appeared to be an ancient hunting camp. The developers agreed to shift the turbine location slightly to avoid the site, a rare victory for archaeology. But for every protected site, there are probably dozens that are damaged or destroyed without anyone knowing. The North Sea covers thousands of square miles. Survey work is expensive and time-consuming. Most of the seabed remains unsurveyed, unmapped, unknown. The lost world of Doggerland is still losing pieces of itself, still vanishing, just in slow motion. What haunts researchers most is the potential. Doggerland existed during a crucial period of human history. This was the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, a time when humans were transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to more settled communities. It was a period of innovation and adaptation, and Doggerland, with its rich resources and strategic location, might have been a center of that transformation. What if there are sites down there that could revolutionize our understanding of prehistoric Europe? What if there are preserved wooden structures, organic materials, even art or ceremonial objects that could never survive on land sites, but might be perfectly preserved in the oxygen-free mud of the seabed? What if there's a Mesolithic Pompeii down there, frozen in time by the tsunami that destroyed it, waiting to tell us its story? There's something profound about the way Doggerland was discovered. It wasn't found by a brilliant archaeologist with a theory and a research grant. It was found by working people, fishermen who spent their days battling the sea, hauling nets, trying to make a living. They were the ones who first touched these artifacts, who first held these messages from the past in their calloused hands. And for decades, nobody listened to them. The fishermen knew they were finding something important. They knew these bones and tools didn't belong on the ocean floor, but the experts dismissed them, too busy with their legitimate excavations, their peer-reviewed theories, to pay attention to what rough men from fishing boats were saying. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the least expected sources. That truth doesn't care about credentials or academic degrees. That paying attention to the people who work closest to the land, or in this case the sea, can reveal wonders. Every artifact pulled from the North Sea is an act of rescue. These objects have been lost for 8,000 years, buried under sediment, scoured by currents, on the verge of being destroyed completely. When a fisherman hauls up a harpoon point or a stone blade, he's saving it, giving it one more chance to tell its story, giving us one more glimpse of a world we almost lost forever. And the detective work continues. Right now, somewhere in the North Sea, there are artifacts being uncovered by storms, bones working their way up through sediment, tools being exposed by currents. The ocean is still giving up its secrets, piece by piece, find by find. Modern technology is helping. High-resolution seafloor mapping is getting cheaper and more accessible. DNA analysis can extract information from tiny fragments of bone or sediment. Underwater drones can explore areas that are too dangerous for human divers. We're getting better at this, more sophisticated in how we search and what we can learn from what we find. But in the end, it's still a treasure hunt. And the treasure is knowledge, understanding, connection to people who lived so long ago that they feel almost mythical, yet who were just as human as we are, who loved their children, feared the storm, celebrated good hunts, mourned their dead, and tried to make sense of a changing world. Somewhere on the floor of the North Sea right now, there's an artifact waiting to be found. Maybe it's a tool dropped by a hunter 10,000 years ago. Maybe it's a piece of carved bone, decorated with patterns that meant something to the person who made it. Maybe it's something we can't even imagine, something that will change everything we think we know. The discovery of Doggerland isn't over. It's just beginning. Every year brings new finds, new data, new pieces of the puzzle. The sonar maps get more detailed. The computer models get more sophisticated, and the artifacts keep coming. Pulled from the deep by nets and storms and chance, like the lost world itself is refusing to be forgotten. The fishermen still go out, still drag their nets across the bottom, and sometimes, tangled in with the fish and the seaweed, there's something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. A whisper from the depths saying, "We were here. We mattered. Remember us." And now, finally, we do. The question is, what else is down there waiting in the dark? What other secrets is the ocean keeping? What other lost worlds are hiding beneath our feet, beneath the waves, just waiting for someone to ask the right questions and look in the right places? The North Sea knows. And if we're patient, if we listen, if we keep searching, it might just tell us. Imagine watching your world drown. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic moment you could point to and say, that's when everything ended. But slowly, inch by inch, generation by generation. The beach where you played as a child is now underwater. The hunting grounds your grandfather described are now marsh. The islands you can see from shore are getting smaller every year, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. This was the reality for the people of Doggerland. For thousands of years they watched their world shrink. They adapted, they moved, they survived, until the day the ocean decided it was done being patient. Until the day a wall of water appeared on the horizon, traveling faster than any human could run, and erased an entire civilization in a matter of hours. To understand how Doggerland died, you have to understand what was happening to the entire planet. Go back about 20,000 years. The Earth is in the grip of the last ice age. Massive ice sheets, some more than 2 miles thick, cover Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Europe. These aren't just glaciers, they're continent-sized mountains of ice, so heavy they actually push the Earth's crust down beneath them. And all that ice is made of water. Water that used to be in the oceans. When you lock up that much water in ice, sea levels drop dramatically. We're talking about 300 to 400 feet lower than they are today. Coastlines extend for hundreds of miles beyond where they are now. Land bridges appear connecting continents that are now separated by sea. The geography of the world is fundamentally different, and in northern Europe, that lower sea level creates Doggerland, a vast, fertile country connecting Britain to the mainland. But around 18,000 years ago, something begins to change. The Earth's orbit shifts slightly. Not much, just a tiny wobble that affects how sunlight hits the planet. But that tiny change is enough. Temperatures start to rise, slowly at first, then faster. And those massive ice sheets, which have stood for 100,000 years, begin to melt. The people living in Doggerland have no idea what's coming. They can't see the glaciers hundreds of miles to the north. They don't understand climate systems or sea levels, or what happens when you melt a continent's worth of ice. All they know is their world. The forests where they hunt, the rivers where they fish, the camps where they return every season. Life is good. Food is abundant. The future seems secure. But beneath their feet the clock is already ticking. For years, scientists knew Doggerland had disappeared. What they didn't know was exactly how. Did it go slowly, peacefully, just gradually shrinking until the last residents migrated away to higher ground? Or was there something more dramatic? The answer came from an unlikely place, a conference room in Norway, where geologists were studying something that had nothing to do with lost civilizations. They were investigating submarine landslides, massive underwater collapses of sediment on the continental shelf. It's the kind of research that sounds boring until you realize what these landslides can do. When billions of tons of mud and rock suddenly slide down into the deep ocean, they displace water. Lots of water, and that water has to go somewhere. Fast. In the 1980s, researchers discovered evidence of one of the largest submarine landslides in history off the coast of Norway. They called it the Storegga Slide, named after the underwater formation where it happened. The scale of it was mind-boggling. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, an area the size of Iceland, had collapsed and slid down into the Norwegian Sea. But when did it happen? And more importantly, what were the consequences? At first, the change is barely noticeable, maybe a few inches per decade. The people living in Doggerland wouldn't see any difference in their lifetimes. But the process is relentless. Like filling a bathtub 1 cup at a time, eventually the water level rises enough to matter. By 16,000 BC, Doggerland's northern coastline is noticeably different from what it had been. Beaches are narrower. Some islands have disappeared. River mouths are becoming estuaries as saltwater pushes inland. The people adapt. They always do. They move their camps back from the coast. They adjust their fishing strategies as rivers change course and flow differently. Life goes on, but the pressure is building because the melt is accelerating. As the climate warms, the glaciers retreat faster. More ice melts, more water pours into the oceans, and the rate of sea level rise increases. By 14,000 BC, Doggerland is noticeably smaller. The northern reaches, which had been rolling tundra and grassland, are now underwater. The coastline is moving south at a pace that people can notice within a generation. Elders tell stories of hunting grounds that are now beneath the waves. Tribal territories have to be renegotiated as groups are pushed into smaller and smaller spaces. Scientists have mapped this process using sediment cores and computer modeling. They can track how the landscape changed century by century. What they found is fascinating and tragic. As Doggerland shrank, it actually became more attractive to humans in some ways. The rising seas created new estuaries, lagoons, and marshlands. These are incredibly rich ecosystems, teeming with fish, waterfowl, and edible plants. Archaeological evidence suggests population density in Doggerland actually increased during this period. People were concentrating in a smaller area, but that area was providing more food than ever. By 10,000 BC, Doggerland has been reduced to about half its maximum size. The land bridge connecting Britain to Europe is still intact, but it's much narrower, maybe 50 miles across at its widest point. The landscape is dominated by wetlands and river deltas. Dense forests of oak and hazel still cover the higher ground, but much of the terrain is marshy, crisscrossed by channels and tidal creeks. But the seas keep rising. By 8000 BC, Doggerland is fragmented. Instead of one continuous landmass, it's become an archipelago, a collection of low-lying islands separated by channels and straits. Picture something like the Florida Keys, but larger and in the North Sea. The largest islands might have been 20 or 30 miles across. Smaller ones would have been just a few miles. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because people are still living there. Archaeological evidence, including those artifacts pulled up by fishermen, dates to this late period. These people were choosing to stay on islands that were clearly doomed. Why? The answer probably has to do with resources and culture. These islands were incredibly productive. The fishing was extraordinary. The marshes attracted huge numbers of migrating birds. And this was home. This was where ancestors were buried, where stories were rooted. Leaving would mean abandoning everything that gave life meaning. Imagine being part of that last generation on the islands. You'd grow up hearing stories from your grandparents about when the islands were bigger, when you could walk to other communities without needing a boat. You'd watch familiar landmarks disappear beneath the rising waters. You'd move your camp inland every few years as the sea encroached, and you'd wonder, probably, how much longer you could hold on. Climate data suggests the period between 8000 and 6000 BC was particularly turbulent. There were probably rapid pulses of sea level rise as particularly large sections of ice sheet collapsed in Scandinavia and North America. Some decades might have seen the sea rise several inches a year, enough to notice within a single lifetime. Storms would have become more devastating as higher seas meant storm surges could reach farther inland. By 6500 BC, Doggerland was on its last legs. The remaining islands were small, low-lying, constantly battered by waves. The population was probably down to a few hundred people spread across several islands. They were the holdouts, the people who refused to leave. Or maybe they had nowhere else to go. Maybe the communities on the British and European mainlands didn't welcome refugees. Maybe leaving meant becoming outcasts in a world where tribal identity was everything. And then, one morning around 6200 BC, someone on those islands looked toward the northern horizon and saw something that would haunt their final moments. A wall of water. The Storegga slide happened at approximately 3 in the afternoon local time. Scientists have been able to estimate this based on the distribution of tsunami deposits and computer modeling of wave propagation. Not that the exact time matters to the people who experienced it. What matters is that they had virtually no warning. Here's how it would have unfolded. 800 kilometers away, off the coast of Norway, the continental shelf suddenly gives way. An area of seafloor 300 kilometers long and tens of kilometers wide, already unstable from earthquakes and pressure changes as the ice sheets retreat, suddenly slides downward. The movement takes less than 20 minutes. 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment, roughly the volume of Iceland, crashes down into the deep Norwegian Sea, displacing an incomprehensible amount of water. The initial wave might have been 30 meters high, 100 feet of water moving outward in all directions at speeds of up to 500 miles per hour. As the wave traveled across the North Sea, it would have slowed and spread out, but it would still have been moving at the speed of a jet plane. The islands of Doggerland were about 600 kilometers from the epicenter. The wave would have taken less than 2 hours to arrive. 2 hours. That's all the warning they might have had, and even that assumes someone noticed the wave coming. On a cloudy day, across choppy seas, you might not see it until it was minutes away. Some researchers believe there might have been a withdrawal of water first, like the sea suddenly draining away from the shore, exposing the seabed. Ancient tsunami warnings from other cultures speak of this phenomenon. People walking out onto the exposed sea floor to pick up stranded fish, not understanding that the water is gathering itself for the strike. When the wave hit Doggerland, it would have been devastating. Computer models suggest waves between 8 and 20 meters high, depending on the exact topography. That's 25 to 65 feet of water, slamming into low-lying islands at tremendous speed. Buildings, if there were any, would have been obliterated instantly. Trees would have been ripped from the ground. Anyone caught in the open would have had no chance. But here's what haunts researchers. We don't know if anyone survived. We have no human remains from this period that show signs of tsunami trauma. We have no clear archaeological evidence of the destruction. Everything is buried under 10,000 years of sediment, or it's been scattered by currents, or it simply didn't preserve. The tsunami is real. The timing is right. The location is perfect for maximum destruction. But we can't prove anyone died. We can only imagine. Some scientists think there might have been survivors. The islands of Doggerland weren't completely flat. There would have been higher ground, hills that might have stood above the surge. If people saw the wave coming, if they ran for those hills, some might have made it. But what would they have survived to? Their homes destroyed, their food stores swept away, their boats gone, their families possibly dead, and the islands themselves damaged, flooded, maybe rendered uninhabitable by saltwater contamination. There's a debate about whether the Storegga tsunami was actually the end of Doggerland, or just the beginning of the end. Some researchers argue that the islands might have survived the wave, battered but intact, only to be abandoned in the following years as they became impossible to live on. Others think small populations clung on for decades or even centuries, living on progressively shrinking islands until the last of the land finally slipped beneath the waves around 5000 BC. Genetic evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. DNA studies of ancient remains from Britain and the Netherlands show continuity through this period. The populations didn't suddenly change. But that doesn't tell us whether the Doggerland refugees were absorbed peacefully into mainland communities, or whether they arrived as traumatized survivors of a disaster. Carrying stories of the day the sea rose up and destroyed their world. What's particularly chilling is that this could happen again. The Storegga slide wasn't a one-time event. It was actually a series of slides over thousands of years. There have been at least 3 major episodes of collapse in that area, and the conditions that caused them, unstable sediment on steep underwater slopes, still exist. There are areas off the coast of Norway right now that geologists consider at risk for future landslides. If another Storegga-scale slide happened today, the tsunami would hit the coasts of Britain, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Millions of people live in areas that would be affected. Oil platforms would be destroyed, coastal cities would be devastated, and we'd have about the same warning time the people of Doggerland had, a few hours at most. There's something uniquely terrifying about water. Fire you can fight. Earthquakes end. Even volcanic eruptions eventually stop. But rising water is relentless. It doesn't tire. It doesn't negotiate. It just keeps coming, inch by inch, year by year, until everything you know is gone. The people of Doggerland experienced both kinds of water disaster. The slow, grinding erosion of their world over thousands of years, and possibly the sudden, violent end of a mega-tsunami. Think about what it must have been like to live through the slow drowning of your homeland. to be told stories by your grandparents about places that no longer exist, to watch your children grow up in a world that's measurably smaller than the one you knew, to wonder every time a storm surge comes higher than expected, whether this is the year your island becomes uninhabitable. There's a grief in that, a particular kind of loss that we're only beginning to understand in our own time as climate change makes itself felt. It's called solastalgia, the distress caused by environmental change in places you love. The people of Doggerland would have felt it acutely. Every lost hunting ground, every abandoned camp, every island that disappeared beneath the waves was a wound. And if the Storega tsunami hit when people were still living there, imagine the trauma of the survivors. One moment you're going about your daily life, fishing maybe, repairing a shelter, playing with your children. And the next moment there's a roar like nothing you've ever heard, a wall of water blotting out the sky, and then chaos. Salt water filling your lungs, being tumbled and broken and swept away. And if you survive, if you manage to cling to something and live through it, you emerge to find everything gone, everyone gone. Ancient cultures around the world have flood myths, the biblical Noah, the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh, the Greek Deucalion, indigenous American traditions of great floods. We usually interpret these as metaphors or exaggerations. But what if some of them are memories, distorted by thousands of years of retelling, but based on real events, real disasters that drowned real lands and killed real people? Could the Storega tsunami have left echoes in myth? Could some of the flood stories told around ancient European fires have been about Doggerland? We'll probably never know. The time depth is too great, the cultural transmission too fragmented. But it's possible. It's possible that somewhere in our collective memory, buried deep, is the knowledge of a world beneath the waves. Today, the North Sea hides its crime. The waters are cold and murky, giving nothing away. Ships pass over the drowned islands of Doggerland without a second thought. Oil platforms drill into the seabed, punching through layers of history without knowing what they're destroying. Fishermen drag their nets across what might be the ruins of the last villages, and once in a while something ancient tumbles out, a message from the depths. But the story of Doggerland isn't just about the past, it's about right now. Sea levels are rising again, faster than they have in thousands of years. Greenland's ice sheet is melting. Antarctica is losing billions of tons of ice every year. The water has to go somewhere. And this time, it's not some prehistoric island that's in danger. It's Miami. It's New York. It's London. It's Amsterdam. Built on land that used to be connected to Doggerland itself. The people of Doggerland couldn't stop the rising waters. They didn't have the technology or the knowledge or the power to hold back the sea. But we do. We know what's happening. We can see the ice melting. We can measure the seas rising. And we have a choice they never had. We can act. Or we can watch our own world drown, just like they did, wondering at what point it became unstoppable. Somewhere beneath the North Sea, in the mud and sand and silt, there might be the remains of the last person who died on Doggerland. Maybe they were caught by the tsunami. Maybe they were just the last holdout, the final resident who refused to leave even as the water took everything. Their bones rest in darkness now. A warning from 8,000 years ago. The sea is patient. It always wins in the end. The only question is whether we'll learn from Doggerland's fate, or whether future generations will look back at maps of our world and wonder what it was like when you could build cities on the coasts. When places like Manhattan and Bangladesh weren't underwater. When the world was shaped the way we remember it. The water is rising again. The only difference is, this time, we've been warned. What if the Bible got it right? Not about the details, maybe. Not about the ark or the animals or the 40 days and nights, but about the core truth. That there was a great flood. That entire worlds were drowned. That people watched their lands disappear beneath rising waters and told stories about it that echoed through thousands of years. What if Noah wasn't fiction, but memory, distorted, mythologized, wrapped in religious meaning, but at its heart, a recollection of something that actually happened? And what if dozens of cultures around the world, separated by oceans and continents, all tell the same story because they all experienced the same catastrophe. Every culture on Earth has a flood story. Every single one. From the frozen north to tropical islands, from ancient empires to isolated tribes, the tale is the same. The world was drowned. Water rose and covered the land. Most of humanity perished. Only a few survived to rebuild. The details change, the names shift, the gods differ, but the skeleton of the story remains constant across time and geography. For centuries, scholars dismissed these as mere mythology, universal fears given narrative form, metaphors for spiritual cleansing or divine judgment. After all, floods are common. Rivers overflow. Storms bring destruction. It made sense that cultures would develop stories about floods without needing any shared historical basis. They were just coincidences, independent inventions, nothing more. But then we started discovering that some of these myths had anchors in reality. That the Great Flood described in the Epic of Gilgamesh might reference an actual flooding event in Mesopotamia. That stories of drowned lands in the Pacific might reflect real islands lost to rising seas. That Aboriginal Australian flood myths might preserve memories of coastlines that existed 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower. And suddenly, these ancient stories didn't seem quite so mythical anymore. They seemed like something else entirely. They seemed like history, oral history, passed down through so many generations that the facts became tangled with legend, but history nonetheless. The kind of history that says, this happened, this was real, and we will never forget. Which brings us to a troubling question. If some flood myths are based on real events, which ones? And more specifically, could any of them be about Doggerland? Could the story of an entire land vanishing beneath the waves, of people fleeing rising waters, of a world that existed and then didn't, have survived in human memory for 8,000 years? It sounds impossible, but the more you look at the myths, the harder they are to dismiss. The connection started with a marine archaeologist named Nick Fleming. In the 1960s, Fleming was diving off the coast of Greece when he discovered something extraordinary. The ruins of an ancient city, perfectly preserved beneath the waves. Pavlopetri, as it's now called, was a Bronze Age settlement that sank due to earthquakes around 1000 BC. But what fascinated Fleming wasn't just the city. It was the local legends. Greek fishermen in the area had always told stories about buildings beneath the water, about seeing walls and streets when the water was clear. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as fantasy. But the fishermen were right. They'd been right all along. They'd preserved an accurate memory of something that happened 3,000 years ago, passed down, generation to generation through oral tradition. Fleming realized something profound. If oral tradition could preserve accurate information for 3,000 years, how much further back could it go? He began collecting flood myths from around the world and comparing them to what we know about post-Ice Age sea level rise. And the correlations were startling. Between 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended and glaciers melted, global sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet. This wasn't uniform or steady. There were periods of rapid rise called meltwater pulses, where sea levels jumped 10 or 20 feet in a matter of decades. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly flooded. Islands vanished. River valleys became bays. Land bridges between continents were severed. Millions of people, our direct ancestors, experienced this. They watched it happen. They fled from it. They told stories about it. And those stories, Fleming argued, might have survived. Transformed, certainly. Mythologized, absolutely. But preserved in the deep structure of flood narratives that appear in virtually every culture on Earth. Other researchers picked up this thread. Geologists started dating ancient coastlines and comparing them to the timelines implied in flood myths. Archaeologists looked for evidence of cultural disruption that coincided with known flooding events. Linguists analyzed the age of flood stories based on the language structures used to tell them. And a picture began to emerge, fragmentary and debated, but tantalizing. Some of these myths might be 8,000 years old. Maybe older. Old enough to remember Doggerland. Old enough to remember the world before the flood. Let's start with the most famous flood story in Western culture, Noah's Ark. Everyone knows the basics. God sees that humanity has become wicked and decides to destroy the world with a flood. He warns Noah, a righteous man, to build an ark and fill it with his family and pairs of every animal. The flood comes, covering even the highest mountains, and destroys everything. After the waters recede, Noah's Ark lands on Mount Ararat, and humanity gets a second chance. The biblical version appears in Genesis, probably written down around 600 BC. But the story is much, much older than that. We know this because virtually the same tale appears in Mesopotamian texts that predate the Bible by more than 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in ancient Sumerian around 2100 BC, contains a detailed flood narrative. In this version, the gods decide to flood the world, but one god, Ea, warns a man named Utnapishtim. He builds a boat, saves his family and animals, and survives a catastrophic deluge that lasts 7 days and nights. Even older is the Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BC. Same story, different name. The gods flood the world. Atrahasis is warned. He builds a boat, he survives, humanity is preserved. The parallels to Noah are so exact that scholars agree the biblical flood story was directly borrowed from these earlier Mesopotamian sources. But here's the critical question. Where did the Mesopotamians get it from? Some researchers believe it references a real flooding event. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the 1990s, suggests that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea broke through a natural dam and catastrophically flooded the Black Sea basin. The water level rose hundreds of feet, drowning thousands of square miles of coastline. People living around the Black Sea would have witnessed their world literally disappearing beneath the waves. Entire communities would have been displaced, forced to flee to higher ground. The timeline works. 5600 BC is well within the range of early human civilization in Mesopotamia. Refugees from the Black Sea flood could have brought their stories south, and those stories could have been passed down orally for thousands of years before being written down in Sumerian texts. But here's what's fascinating. 5600 BC is also right after the Storegga tsunami, right in the window when Doggerland was making its final disappearance. Could the Mesopotamian flood myths be remembering multiple flooding events, including the drowning of Doggerland? Let's look at another tradition. Hindu mythology. In the Matsya Purana, written down around 500 AD but drawing on much older oral traditions, there's a story about Manu, the first man. A fish warns Manu that a great flood is coming that will destroy all life. Manu builds a boat, fills it with seeds and animals and the 7 great sages, and survives the deluge. After the flood, Manu becomes the progenitor of a new human race. Sound familiar? The parallels to Noah and Gilgamesh are obvious, but here's what's intriguing. Hindu traditions claim this flood happened at the end of the last Satya Yuga, which various calculations place somewhere between 10,000 and 3000 BC, right in the window of post-Ice Age flooding. And Hindu texts describe not just one flood, but multiple ones, corresponding to different cycles of creation and destruction. What if these represent memories of different flooding events as sea levels rose in pulses? The Greek tradition gives us Deucalion. Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood because of their wickedness. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest, essentially a boat, and survives with his wife Pyrrha. After 9 days, the flood recedes and they land on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the world by throwing stones over their shoulders, which become people. The Greek version is later than the Mesopotamian ones, written down around 400 BC, but claiming to reference much earlier events. Some scholars think the Greeks borrowed the flood story from Near Eastern sources during trade contacts. Others believe it might reflect a distinct flooding event in the Mediterranean, possibly the Minoan eruption of Thera around 1600 BC, which caused massive tsunamis. But flood myths aren't limited to the Middle East and Europe. Travel to the Americas and you find dozens of Native American flood traditions. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds destroyed by water. The Ojibwe tell of a great flood survived by one man in a canoe. The Aztecs describe a flood that turned people into fish. The Inca remember a flood that covered even the highest mountains. Some researchers dismiss these as evidence of shared memory because the Americas were populated separately from the Old World. The flood myths couldn't be about the same events because the cultures weren't in contact. But here's the thing. The Americas also experienced catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. When the glaciers melted, massive glacial lakes formed behind ice dams. When those dams broke, biblical quantities of water would have been released in a matter of days or hours. The Missoula floods in the Pacific Northwest are a perfect example. Around 15,000 years ago, a glacial lake the size of Lake Ontario was held back by an ice dam in what's now Montana. When the dam failed, 500 cubic miles of water exploded across Washington state at 65 miles per hour, scouring everything in its path. This happened multiple times as the ice dam reformed and broke again. People living in the region would have witnessed catastrophes that made modern floods look like puddles. They would have told stories, and those stories would have been passed down. Move to the Pacific and the flood myths continue. Aboriginal Australians have detailed oral traditions about coastlines that existed when sea levels were lower. They describe islands that are now underwater, bays that used to be dry land, specific geographical features that match what we know about the Australian coast 12,000 years ago. Researchers studying these traditions have confirmed their accuracy using geological data. These stories are at least 10,000 years old, maybe older, passed down through 400 generations with remarkable fidelity. Polynesian cultures throughout the Pacific have flood myths. The Maori speak of Tauhaki and the Great Flood. Hawaiians remember Nu, who survived a flood in a boat. Tahitians describe the sea rising and covering the land. Many of these islands are volcanic and sit on tectonically active zones. Tsunamis are a real and recurring threat. But some of these myths might also remember larger events, like the drowning of Sundaland. Sundaland is Southeast Asia's Doggerland. During the Ice Age, sea levels were so low that Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand were all connected as one massive landmass. This area was likely heavily populated, a tropical paradise rich with resources. As sea levels rose, Sundaland was progressively drowned, shrinking from a subcontinent to the scattered islands we see today. The last of it vanished around 6,000 years ago, the same time as Doggerland. Millions of people would have experienced the drowning of Sundaland. They would have fled to the remaining islands and highlands, and they would have told stories that might have become the foundation for flood myths throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Researchers have found submerged settlements off the coast of India dating to over 9,000 years ago. Cities beneath the waves, just like Doggerland, and local traditions in the area speak of lands that sank, kingdoms that drowned, golden ages lost to the sea. So here's the uncomfortable question. Are all these stories connected? Is there one myth, one original flood story that spread across the world as humans migrated? Or are they independent memories of separate but similar events? Or, and this is what most mainstream scholars believe, are they just archetypes? Universal metaphors that have nothing to do with real floods at all? The debate is fierce. On one side, you have researchers like Nick Fleming and geologists like William Ryan who argue that many flood myths have cores of historical truth. They point to the remarkable specificity in some traditions. Aboriginal Australians don't just say, "there was a flood." They describe particular landmarks, particular islands, particular geographical features that can be verified. That's not metaphor, that's memory. Linguists studying very old oral traditions have found that some can remain stable for thousands of years, especially if they're tied to important survival knowledge or cultural identity. The flood stories aren't random entertainment. They're foundational myths repeated in ritual contexts considered sacred and essential. The kind of stories that communities work hard to preserve accurately. And the timing fits too well to ignore. The period between 10,000 and 6,000 BC was catastrophic for coastal populations worldwide. Sea levels rose over 300 feet. The changes weren't steady. There were rapid pulses where the ocean would rise several feet per year. Entire landscapes vanished. Populations were displaced. If any event in human history should have left a mark on collective memory, it's this one. But the skeptics make strong points too. They argue that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We create stories to explain our fears and the world around us. Floods are terrifying and memorable. Every culture experiences floods. It's not surprising that every culture would develop flood stories without needing any shared historical basis. The similarities, they argue, are due to convergent cultural evolution, not shared memory. They also point out that many flood myths are clearly symbolic. The biblical flood, for instance, is explicitly about divine judgment and moral cleansing. It's theology, not history. The details don't match any possible real event. Covering the entire world, including the highest mountains, would require more water than exists on Earth. The story is meant to teach a lesson about righteousness, not record a historical event. And the timeline problems are significant. Writing was invented around 3200 BC in Mesopotamia. Everything before that is oral tradition, and oral traditions change. They evolve. They absorb new details and lose old ones. The idea that a story could remain accurate for 8,000 years through 300 generations of retelling strikes many scholars as implausible. But then there's the DNA evidence. Genetic studies of modern populations show bottlenecks, periods where human population numbers crash dramatically. One of the most significant bottlenecks occurs right around 6,000, 8,000 years ago. Something reduced human population significantly during this period. Climate change, disease, or massive displacement and death due to flooding. The genetic evidence can't tell us which, but it confirms that something dramatic happened to human populations at exactly the time when Doggerland and Sunderland were disappearing. There's also fascinating research on what's called mythic memory. Psychologist Frederick Bartlett studied how stories change when passed from person to person. He found that while details shift dramatically, the core structure often remains stable. The skeleton of a story, its basic plot and message, can survive even as specifics change. So maybe that's what flood myths are. The skeleton of real events, with the flesh of cultural and religious meaning added over thousands of years. Some researchers are trying to test these ideas directly. They're looking for flood myths that make specific geographical claims that can be verified. One study analyzed Aboriginal Australian stories and found that they accurately described features of the coastline that existed over 7,000 years ago. The stories had preserved real information across an astonishing span of time. If it worked in Australia, could it work elsewhere? The problem is most flood myths don't include enough geographical detail to verify. They speak in generalities. The water rose, the land drowned, people fled. That could be anywhere, any flooding event. Only a few include specific details that can be matched to actual drowned landscapes. And even then, correlation doesn't prove causation. Just because a myth describes a drowned land doesn't mean it's referring to a specific historical flood rather than a general fear of the sea. But here's what moves me about this whole question. The idea that we might be carrying memories from 8,000 years ago in our stories. That when we read about Noah or hear about Deucalion or listen to Aboriginal songlines, we might be touching something real, something that happened to actual people who felt actual terror as the water rose. Think about what it would mean to preserve a memory for that long. 300 generations. Every single one had to hear the story and consider it important enough to pass on to their children. For 8,000 years, through migrations and wars and cultural upheavals, the story survived. That's not just impressive, that's almost sacred. It suggests these events weren't just natural disasters, they were foundational traumas, shaping how entire cultures understood themselves and their relationship to the world. And if these myths are memories, then they're doing something profound. They're making the people of Doggerland and Sunderland immortal, not as individuals, but as a collective experience. Every time someone tells the flood story, they're resurrecting those drowned worlds, giving voice to people who watched their homes disappear and had no way to record what they'd lost except through story. There's a weight to that, a responsibility. Because if these myths are memories, we owe it to our ancestors to try to understand them, to separate the truth from the embellishment, to reconstruct as best we can what actually happened. Not to prove the Bible literally true or to validate any particular religion, but to honor the experience of real people who suffered through real catastrophes. And there's a warning in these stories too. Every flood myth ends the same way, with a handful of survivors starting over. The old world is gone. The people who lived there are dead. Everything they built, everything they knew, underwater. The myths are saying, this has happened before. This can happen again. The world you know is not permanent. The ground beneath your feet, the coastlines on your maps, they can all vanish. We're living through our own version of this story right now. Sea levels are rising, coastlines are flooding, island nations are making plans to evacuate entirely. Miami is installing pumps to deal with regular flooding that didn't exist 20 years ago. The Maldives are building floating cities because their islands will be underwater within decades. We are the pre-flood civilization in someone's future myth. Will our story be preserved? In 8,000 years, will there be myths about the great cities that drowned? Will people tell stories about New York and Shanghai and Mumbai the way we tell stories about Atlantis? Will they wonder if we were real or just metaphors? Will researchers debate whether the myths of the drowned towers contain any historical truth? Here's what we know for certain. Between 10 and 6,000 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically. Entire lands vanished beneath the waves. Millions of people were displaced. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years were destroyed. This happened. This is geological fact. Here's what we know with reasonable confidence. Many cultures around the world have flood myths. Some of these myths contain details that match real flooding events. Aboriginal Australian stories describe drowned coastlines that actually existed. The Mesopotamian flood myths align chronologically with the Black Sea deluge. The timing is too consistent to be pure coincidence. And here's what we don't know but desperately want to. Are any of these myths about Doggerland specifically? When the Bible speaks of Noah, when Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, when Hindu texts describe Manu, are they remembering even distantly the people who watched Doggerland drown? Did the Storegga tsunami live on in human memory, transformed over millennia into stories of divine judgment and miraculous survival? We may never know for certain. The time gap is too vast. The cultural changes too profound. The evidence too fragmentary. But the possibility alone is staggering. That somewhere in our oldest stories, buried under layers of meaning and metaphor, there might be a memory of the lost kingdom beneath the North Sea, a memory of the world before the flood. Every time a fisherman pulls up a tool from Doggerland's depths, we recover a fragment of that lost world. But the stories, if they exist, preserve something even more valuable: the human experience of loss, the grief of watching your world vanish, the terror of the rising water, the desperate hope that something, anything might survive. So the next time you hear a flood myth, pause for a moment. Consider that it might not be just a story. It might be the oldest thing you've ever heard. Older than writing, older than cities, older than agriculture. A message from the deep past saying, "We were here, we saw the world change, we survived, remember us." And somewhere beneath the cold waters of the North Sea, the drowned land waits, keeping its secrets while we tell our stories and wonder if we're remembering more than we know. Beneath the cold, dark waters of the North Sea lies a secret that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about human history. A land bigger than many modern countries. a civilization that thrived for thousands of years, and then it vanished. But here's the strange part. Almost nobody talks about it. Why? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Europe 20,000 years ago. The world was colder. Ice sheets stretched across the northern hemisphere like a frozen blanket. Sea levels sat 300 feet lower than they are today. And where fishermen now trawl the North Sea for cod and herring, there was land. Not just a sliver of coastline or a small island chain. We're talking about a massive, thriving landscape roughly the size of modern-day England, rolling hills, wide river valleys, forests teeming with deer, aurochs, and wild boar. This place had a name, though the people who lived there never called it that. Today, we know it as Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, a shallow sandbank where fishing nets keep pulling up something extraordinary. Not fish, not rocks, but the remnants of a lost world. A world where our ancestors built communities, hunted mammoth, raised families, told stories under starlit skies, and had no idea that one day the ocean would swallow everything they ever knew. So why, in all your years of history class, did no one ever mention this? Why does this incredible chapter of human civilization feel like it's been buried twice? Once by water, and once by silence. The first clues started washing up over a century ago. Fishermen working the Dogger Bank, about 60 miles off the coast of England, kept hauling up strange objects in their nets. Bones, huge, ancient bones. Tusks from woolly mammoths. Antlers from giant elk. Tools made from flint and bone, clearly shaped by human hands. At first, these finds were curiosities, oddities sold to collectors or tossed back into the sea. But one discovery changed everything. In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Calinda dragged up something that couldn't be ignored. Tangled in the nets, covered in mud and seaweed, was a chunk of peat. And embedded in that peat was a barbed antler point, a weapon, meticulously carved by someone who lived more than 10,000 years ago. This wasn't just debris. This was proof. Proof that humans had lived, hunted, and died on land that now sat beneath 60 feet of seawater. The archaeologist who examined it, a man named Clement Reed, had theorized decades earlier that a landmass once connected Britain to Europe. But theories are one thing. Holding a weapon made by a person who walked that drowned world, that's something else entirely. Suddenly, questions began to surface. How big was this land? How many people lived there? What were their lives like? And the biggest question of all, what happened to them? Because if an entire landscape could disappear beneath the waves, taking countless communities with it, what does that say about the stability of our own world? For decades, Doggerland remained a mystery whispered about in academic circles but largely ignored by mainstream history. Then, in the early 2000s, technology caught up with curiosity. Researchers at the University of Birmingham began using data originally collected by oil companies, seismic survey data mapping the floor of the North Sea. What they found was breathtaking. Beneath the sediment, the sonar revealed an entire prehistoric landscape frozen in time. River channels snaking for miles, coastlines, lagoons, marshlands, hills rising and falling like the gentle breath of the earth itself. Scientists could trace ancient rivers that once flowed with fresh water, rivers where people would have fished, where children played, where communities gathered. Using advanced computer modeling, they reconstructed what Doggerland would have looked like at different points in history, and what emerged was nothing short of astounding. Around 15,000 years ago, as the Ice Age began loosening its grip, Doggerland was paradise for Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The land was rich and fertile. Herds of reindeer migrated through in massive numbers. Rivers teemed with salmon. The estuaries attracted flocks of birds. Forests of birch and pine offered shelter and fuel. This wasn't some barren wasteland. This was prime real estate. Some archaeologists now believe that Doggerland may have been one of the most densely populated regions in prehistoric Europe. Think about that. Not the caves of France, not the Mediterranean coast, but this now drowned land beneath the North Sea. Divers and fishing trawlers continue to bring up artifacts. Bone harpoons, flint blades, fragments of worked wood. even the remains of animals that have been extinct for millennia. Each fragment tells a story. A mammoth tusk with butchery marks suggests a successful hunt, perhaps a feast that fed an entire group for weeks. A delicate bone needle hints at someone sewing hides into clothing, preparing for the winter cold. These weren't primitive savages grunting in the darkness. These were humans just like us. They loved, they laughed, they feared, they hoped. But here's where it gets eerie. Despite all this evidence, despite the magnitude of the discovery, Doggerland remains largely absent from textbooks, museum exhibits, and public consciousness. Why? What is it about this drowned world that makes modern academia so uncomfortable? Let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the mammoth beneath the sea. There are theories, some whispered quietly in the corners of conferences, others shouted boldly across internet forums about why Doggerland doesn't fit neatly into the narrative we've been taught. First, there's the timeline problem. Conventional history tells us that human civilization, real civilization, began around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago with the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the early Chinese dynasties. Before that, just scattered tribes of primitive hunter-gatherers, right? But Doggerland was inhabited, thriving even, between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago. That's a span of 13,000 years. 13 millennia of human culture, innovation, and society existing in a place that's now completely inaccessible. What if those people weren't just surviving? What if they were developing complex societies, spiritual practices, technologies that never made it into the archaeological record because they're buried under the sea? Some researchers suggest that Doggerland may have been a cultural crossroads. Britain wasn't an island back then. It was the western edge of a vast European plain. People could walk from what is now Spain to Scotland without ever seeing the ocean. Ideas, tools, genes, they all flowed freely. So why do we treat British prehistory as if it existed in isolation? Why do timelines focus on Mediterranean cultures while ignoring the possibility that sophisticated societies existed in the north? Then there's the catastrophe itself. Around 6200 BCE, something apocalyptic happened. Geological evidence points to a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway called the Storegga Slide. Millions of cubic meters of sediment gave way, triggering a tsunami that slammed into Doggerland with unimaginable force. Waves possibly reaching 80 feet high swept across the low-lying landscape. Within hours, entire communities would have been obliterated. Survivors would have fled to higher ground, only to watch as the sea kept rising, year after year, swallowing everything they'd ever known. This wasn't myth. This was a real documented event, and it happened at a time when humans were there to witness it. Imagine the stories passed down through generations. Tales of a great flood that devoured the world. Sound familiar? Flood myths exist in cultures across the globe. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah, Hindu texts, Native American legends. We often dismiss these as primitive attempts to explain natural disasters. But what if some of them are cultural memories of real events? What if the story of Doggerland's drowning was carried by survivors who spread across Europe, their trauma encoded in the myths we now call fiction? Here's the uncomfortable question. If we accept that a sophisticated society could rise and vanish beneath the waves, leaving almost no trace, what else might we be missing? How many other chapters of human history are hidden beneath the ocean, buried under sand, lost to time? And perhaps more importantly, who benefits from keeping the story simple, linear, and confined to the past 7,000 years? Some argue it's not conspiracy, just practicality. Underwater archaeology is expensive. The North Sea is cold, dark, and treacherous. Funding goes to more accessible sites. But is that really all it is? Or is there an institutional resistance to anything that challenges the established narrative? After all, if we admit that advanced societies existed long before the accepted cradles of civilization, we have to rewrite the textbooks. We have to reconsider everything we thought we knew about human progress. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. There's something deeply haunting about Doggerland. Not just the tragedy of its loss, but what it represents. Every person who ever lived there, every child who learned to walk on that land, every elder who shared wisdom around evening fires, every artist who carved beauty into bone, they're gone. Not just dead, but erased. Their homes, their tools, their art, their stories, all submerged beneath a sea that doesn't care about memory. Stand on the eastern shore of England and look out at the North Sea. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, is the place where your ancestors might have lived. Because if you have European ancestry, chances are some thread of your DNA traces back to the people of Doggerland. When the land disappeared, they didn't just vanish, they fled, they adapted. They became the people who populated Britain, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Germany. Their blood runs in millions of people alive today. But beyond genetics, there's a more profound connection. Doggerland is a mirror held up to our own era. Those people didn't know their world was ending. They didn't wake up one morning and think, "Today, the ocean will erase everything." It happened gradually, over generations. A shoreline that retreated year by year, freshwater sources that turned brackish, hunting grounds that became marshes, then lagoons, then open sea. By the time anyone realized the scale of what was happening, it was too late to stop it. Does that sound familiar? We live in a time when sea levels are rising again. Coastal cities plan for futures that may not exist. Islands are disappearing. Scientists warn of tipping points and slow catastrophes. The people of Doggerland couldn't stop the ice from melting. They had no control over the Storega slide. But they were human, just like us. They loved their homes. They must have fought to hold on, to adapt, to save what they could. And in the end, the Earth did what the Earth does. It changed, indifferent to human need. There's also something humbling about realizing how fragile our own legacy is. We build cities of steel and glass. We store our knowledge in clouds and servers. We think we're permanent. But what will archaeologists 10,000 years from now find of us? If the seas rise, if the climate shifts, if civilization collapses and rebuilds, will future humans puzzle over our remains the way we puzzle over Doggerland? Will they wonder why we're not in their textbooks? Doggerland teaches us that the Earth belongs to no one, that the places we call home are temporary, that history is far longer and stranger than we've been taught. And maybe, just maybe, it teaches us to listen more carefully to the land, the sea, and the warnings they whisper. So why don't we talk about Doggerland? Maybe it's because the story is incomplete, and humans hate unanswered questions. Maybe it's because it's easier to focus on civilizations that left behind pyramids and temples rather than those erased by water. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because Doggerland forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That history is not a straight line, that progress is not guaranteed, that entire worlds can disappear, taking their knowledge, their people, and their stories with them. Right now, beneath the North Sea, there are landscapes untouched since the last human walked them 12,000 years ago. There are tools lying in the silt. There are hearths that once warmed families through winter nights. There are bones of children who never got the chance to grow old. And somewhere in that drowned world, there are answers to questions we haven't even thought to ask yet. The sea keeps its secrets well. But every storm, every trawler net, every sonar scan reveals a little more. Piece by piece, the story of Doggerland is surfacing, and when it finally does, when we can no longer ignore the magnitude of what was lost, we'll have to face a deeper question. What else have we forgotten? What other ghosts lie beneath the waves, waiting for someone to remember their names? Because if an entire land can vanish from memory, what makes you think our world is any different? Imagine waking up one morning and your entire world is gone, not destroyed by war, not wiped out by disease, but swallowed, completely consumed by the sea. Impossible, right? Except it's already happened. An entire civilization, bigger than England, erased from the map. And the terrifying part, it could happen again. To us. To the cities we call home. Are Miami, New York, and London living on borrowed time? 20,000 years ago, if you wanted to walk from London to Amsterdam, you wouldn't need a plane or a boat. You'd just walk. Through forests, across rivers, past herds of wild animals grazing on endless plains. The North Sea didn't exist as we know it. Instead, there was land. A massive stretch of earth called Doggerland. It connected Britain to mainland Europe like a bridge made of soil, grass, and stone. This wasn't empty wilderness. This was home. Families lived there. Children grew up there. People hunted, gathered, built shelters, told stories under the stars, and believed, like we do, that their world was permanent, solid, safe. They had no reason to think otherwise. The land had been there for thousands of years. Why would it ever leave? But here's the thing about the Earth. It doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't send warnings you can't ignore. Between 18,000 and 6,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened. Slowly at first, then faster. The Ice Age ended, glaciers melted, sea levels rose, and inch by inch, year by year, generation by generation, Doggerland began to drown. By 6500 BCE, it was gone, completely submerged beneath what we now call the North Sea. An entire world, erased. And here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud: if it happened to them? Why do we think we're any different? For most of human history, Doggerland was forgotten. It existed only in myth, in vague flood stories passed down through generations. Then, in 1931, something strange happened. A fishing boat called the Calinda was trawling the Dogger Bank, about 60 miles off the coast of England, when the crew pulled up their nets and found something that didn't belong. Tangled in the ropes, covered in mud and ancient peat, was an object that made time stop. A barbed spear point, carved from deer antler, over 10,000 years old. This wasn't just an artifact. It was proof. Proof that people had once walked, lived, and hunted on ground that now sits beneath 60 feet of cold, dark water. The fisherman had no idea what he was holding, but when archaeologists examined it, they realized they were touching a weapon made by someone whose entire world had been swallowed by the sea. Someone who had no idea that everything they knew would one day be legend. Suddenly, the questions came flooding in. How big was this lost land? How many people lived there? What were their lives like? And most importantly, what happened? Because if an entire country-sized landmass could vanish beneath the waves, taking countless generations with it, then what does that say about the cities we've built on coastlines today? What does it say about us? For decades, Doggerland remained a ghost story in academic circles, a footnote, a curiosity. But in the early 2000s, researchers at the University of Birmingham got their hands on something remarkable: seismic data from oil companies scanning the floor of the North Sea. They weren't looking for lost civilizations, they were looking for oil. But what they found was so much more valuable. Beneath the mud and sediment, the sonar painted a picture of an entire drowned landscape. River valleys that once flowed with fresh water, coastlines where waves lapped gently against the shore, lagoons, marshes, hills, forests. Using computer mapping technology, scientists began to reconstruct what Doggerland looked like at different points in time. And what emerged from the data was breathtaking. Around 15,000 years ago, Doggerland wasn't just habitable. It was paradise. The land was low-lying and fertile. Massive rivers cut through it, teeming with salmon and trout. Estuaries attracted migrating birds by the thousands. Forests of birch and pine offered shelter and firewood. Herds of deer, wild boar, and aurochs roamed freely. For Stone Age hunter-gatherers, this was the best real estate in Europe. Some scientists now believe Doggerland may have been one of the most densely populated regions of the prehistoric world. Think about that. Not the sunny Mediterranean, not the protected caves of France, but this drowned land beneath the North Sea, and the evidence keeps surfacing. Fishing trawlers still pull up artifacts regularly. Flint tools, bone harpoons, the jawbone of a woolly mammoth with human tool marks on it. A single fragment of worked wood preserved in the oxygen-free mud for millennia. Each piece tells the same story. People lived here. They thrived here. and then the ocean took it all. But here's what haunts researchers the most. Doggerland didn't disappear overnight. It died slowly. Over thousands of years, the people who lived there watched their world shrink. Coastlines retreated. Freshwater rivers turned brackish as saltwater crept inland. Hunting grounds became wetlands, then shallow lagoons, then open sea. Families had to move. Communities were displaced, and with each generation, there was less land and more water. Until finally, around 6200 BCE, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that slammed into what remained of Doggerland, with waves up to 80 feet high. The few survivors scattered, and the land was gone forever. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That same slow drowning is happening right now, today, to us. So why don't we talk about Doggerland? Why isn't it in every history textbook? Why don't museums have entire wings dedicated to this lost world? Some say it's because underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult. The North Sea is cold, murky, and treacherous. Funding is hard to come by. But others whisper a different reason, a more uncomfortable one. Maybe we don't talk about Doggerland because it's a mirror we're afraid to look into. Here's the thing. Doggerland doesn't fit neatly into the narrative we've been taught. We're told that human civilization is a story of constant progress, that we build, advance, and grow stronger with each generation. We like our history linear, simple, comforting. But Doggerland tells a different story. It says that entire civilizations can exist for thousands of years and then vanish completely, leaving almost nothing behind. It says that the places we think are permanent aren't. And if we accept that, then we have to ask harder questions. Questions like, how many other advanced societies have been erased by rising seas? How much human history is lost forever beneath the ocean? And the most terrifying question of all, are we next? Because the same forces that drowned Doggerland are active right now. Ice sheets are melting. Greenland loses approximately 280 billion tons of ice every year. Antarctica is losing about 150 billion tons. The ocean is rising approximately 3 millimeters per year, and that rate is accelerating. 3 millimeters doesn't sound like much, does it? But the people of Doggerland would tell you, if they could, that the ocean doesn't take your world in a single gulp. It takes it inch by inch, so slowly you don't notice until it's too late. Scientists project that by 2100, global sea levels could rise anywhere from 1 to 6 feet, depending on how fast the ice melts. 6 feet. That's enough to redraw the map of the world. That's enough to erase cities. And unlike the people of Doggerland, we know it's coming. We have the data. We have the science. We have the warning. So why aren't we acting like our lives depend on it? There's something deeply human about Doggerland that goes beyond archaeology and climate data. Every person who lived there loved someone. They had favorite places, a particular tree they always passed on the way to the river, a hill where they watched the sunset, a spot by the fire where they felt safe. They had memories, dreams, fears, and hopes. They were us, just born in a different time. And they watched their world die. Imagine that. Imagine your grandfather telling you about land that used to be solid ground, now covered by the sea. Imagine your children asking where they'll raise their own children because the places you grew up are disappearing. Imagine knowing deep in your bones that the world is changing and there's nothing you can do to stop it. That's not ancient history. That's trauma. That's loss. That's grief on a scale we can barely comprehend. But here's the connection that should shake us to our core. We're living that story right now. The people of Doggerland couldn't stop the glaciers from melting. They had no control over natural climate cycles. But us? We're not facing a natural cycle. We're facing a crisis of our own making. And unlike them, we have a choice. Right now, today, there are children playing on beaches in Miami who might live to see those same beaches 50 feet underwater. There are families in Bangladesh living on land that could be submerged within their lifetime. There are entire island nations, the Maldives, Tuvalu, Kiribati, that are literally disappearing. These aren't projections. These aren't maybes. This is happening. And the cruelest part? The people suffering most are the ones who contributed least to the problem. A child in the Maldives didn't build coal plants or drive gas-guzzling SUVs. A farmer in Bangladesh didn't create the Industrial Revolution, but they're paying the price. Just like the people of Doggerland paid the price for forces beyond their control. Doggerland teaches us that the Earth doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care about innocence. It doesn't care about how much you love your home. When the water rises, it takes everything, and it doesn't look back. So let's talk about the future, your future, because Doggerland isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning label written in stone and sediment, waiting for someone to read it. Picture Miami on a hot summer day. South Beach packed with tourists. Art Deco buildings painted in pastel colors. Luxury condos lining the waterfront. Millionaires sipping cocktails on balconies overlooking the Atlantic. Now picture it in 2080. Scientists estimate that Miami could experience 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise by the end of this century. And here's the thing most people don't understand. That doesn't mean water lapping at doorsteps. That means entire neighborhoods gone. Streets where kids ride bikes today become coral reefs tomorrow. The hospital where you were born? Underwater. The park where you had your first kiss? A dive site for future archaeologists. Miami is already spending billions on pumps and sea walls, trying to hold back the inevitable. But engineers will tell you off the record that they're not building solutions. They're building delays, because you can't fight the ocean forever. Eventually, it wins. It always wins. New York City, 8 million people. The financial capital of the world. Wall Street, Times Square. The subway system that moves the lifeblood of the city. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, storm surges flooded subway tunnels and knocked out power to millions. That was a preview, a glimpse. Scientists say that by 2100, the kind of flooding that happens once a century could happen once a month. Imagine trying to run a city where the streets flood regularly, where the subway system becomes unusable, where the cost of insurance makes it impossible to live near the water. How long before people start leaving? How long before the greatest city in the world begins its slow retreat? London, 2,000 years of history, the seat of an empire, Parliament, the Thames, Tower Bridge. The city has protected itself with the Thames Barrier since 1982, and when it was built, engineers expected to close it about twice a year. Now, it closes multiple times every winter, and experts say it will be inadequate by 2070, so what then? Build a bigger barrier? And then what? Because the ocean isn't going to stop rising. Not in 2070, not in 2100, not until we fundamentally change how we live. But it's not just the famous cities. It's Venice, already drowning despite billions spent on flood barriers. It's Jakarta, sinking so fast that Indonesia is building an entirely new capital city. It's Amsterdam, New Orleans, Tokyo, Shanghai. 40% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of a coast. That's 3 billion people, and every single one of them is living on land that's more temporary than they think. The parallels to Doggerland are terrifying. The people there didn't wake up one morning to find their world gone. It happened gradually. A coastline that retreated a little each year, marshes that spread, rivers that changed course, hunting grounds that turned to swampland. By the time anyone understood the scale of what was happening, it was too late. The land was gone, and the survivors had to start over somewhere else, carrying only memories of a world that no longer existed. Are we so different? We watch the news. We see the reports. We know the ice is melting. We know the seas are rising. We know entire ecosystems are collapsing, and yet we go about our lives as if tomorrow is guaranteed, as if the earth will bend to our schedules, our economies, our convenience. We're like the late-stage inhabitants of Doggerland, watching the water creep closer, telling ourselves we have time. But here's the difference, the one thing that should haunt us. The people of Doggerland couldn't have stopped what was coming. The end of the Ice Age was beyond their control, but us? We know exactly why this is happening. We know what causes it. We know how to slow it, maybe even stop it. And yet we don't. Not really. not at the scale required. We make small changes, we recycle, we buy electric cars, we pat ourselves on the back for using paper straws. And the ice keeps melting, the water keeps rising, the clock keeps ticking. Future humans, if they exist, will study us the way we study Doggerland. They'll use sonar to map our drowned cities. They'll send diving robots to explore flooded subway tunnels. They'll pull up artifacts from the seafloor, a corroded iPhone, a street sign from Fifth Avenue, a child's toy from a Miami suburb. And they'll ask the same questions we ask about Doggerland. What were their lives like? Did they know what was coming? And if they knew, why didn't they stop it? What will the answer be? That we were too busy, too divided, too convinced that someone else would solve it? That we chose short-term profit over long-term survival? That we saw the water rising and decided it was someone else's problem? Doggerland is gone, its people scattered or drowned, or its stories lost, its buildings, if there were any, dissolved into sediment. The only trace left is bones and tools dragged up by fishing nets, fragments of lives that once mattered just as much as yours does now. And here's the unbearable truth. We're living in the late days of our own Doggerland. Future generations will look back at this moment, right now, today, as the time when we still could have changed course, when the water was rising but hadn't yet taken everything, when we had a choice. So what will we choose? Will we be the generation that woke up and fought for survival? Or will we be the cautionary tale whispered about in a future we'll never see? Will our cities stand? Or will they join Doggerland beneath the waves, forgotten and silent, while the ocean rolls on, patient and indifferent as always? The people of Doggerland couldn't answer these questions, but we can. The only question is, will we? Before the water rises too high, before Miami becomes a memory, before New York is a dive site, before London is a legend, before we become the civilization that future humans study, wondering why we saw it coming and did nothing. The ocean is rising, history is watching, and time, like the tide, waits for no one.